When I first inherited my grandfather's sprawling ranch on the outskirts of town, I thought my biggest challenge would be figuring out how to maintain the land and carry on the legacy he had built with his bare hands. But I had no idea that a storm of conflict was brewing just over the horizon. The property stretched across hundreds of acres of rolling plains, with oak trees scattered along the creeks, and the soil, though dry, had sustained cattle, horses, and generations of my family with its quiet abundance. Yet not far from the boundaries of the ranch sat a massive subdivision managed by the most notorious homeowners association in the county, an HOA so infamous for their strict rules, fines, and power-hungry antics that people in town spoke of them with a mixture of disgust and pity for the residents who had signed up for such misery. And at first, I paid them no mind because their world of manicured lawns, painted fences, and squabbling over mailbox colors had nothing to do with the open fields and freedom of my land. But trouble began the day I noticed heavy equipment moving near the property line and a survey crew hammering in stakes where no one had any business trespassing. When I rode out to see what they were doing, one of the crew members sheepishly told me they were working on a community pipeline project authorized by the HOA board, a pipeline meant to divert water from the creek that cut through the far side of my ranch and pump it straight into there. Artificial lakes, fountains, and irrigation systems that kept their golf course lawns unnaturally green year round. And I remember sitting tall on my horse, stunned that they could even think of running a pipeline across land that clearly didn't belong to them, my family's fence posts marking the boundary for more than 70 years. Yet when I confronted the project manager, he brushed me off, claiming they had the necessary permissions, though when pressed, he couldn't show a single deed, easement, or legal document, and instead muttered something about community necessity as if that gave them the right to carve through private property. So I told him in no uncertain terms to pack up his equipment and leave before I called the sheriff. But the very next morning, I found bulldozers had pushed past my fence, dug a long trench, and started laying steel pipe directly into the earth of my pasture. Rage boiled in me like I had never felt before. Because this wasn't just trespassing, it was theft, it was arrogance, it was the HOA deciding that because their needs outweighed mine, they could steal water that had flowed across my family's ranch for generations. And to make matters worse, when I stormed into the HOA's office to demand an explanation, the smug president of their board, a slick man in a tailored suit who lived in a mansion-sized house with perfect hedges, looked me in the eye and said, "You should be grateful. This project increases property value for the whole area, including your ranch, as if siphoning off my water rights and tearing up my land was a gift rather than a crime." And when I threatened legal action, he laughed, telling me their lawyers had more resources than I could ever dream of, and that I might as well accept the inevitable because progress doesn't wait for anyone. But he underestimated just how stubborn I could be because my grandfather had taught me that land and water were sacred, not just property, but lifeblood. And if I let these bureaucratic bullies walk all over me once, they'd never stop. So while the HOA pressed forward with their legal pipeline, stringing steel like a snake through the soil of my ranch, I began gathering every deed, water right, and historical documents stored in the old safe at the ranch house, proving that the creek and its flow legally belonged to my property and that no outside entity had claimed to even a drop without my consent. But deep down, I knew paper and words weren't enough to fight a machine fueled by arrogance and money. And as I stood by the creek one evening, watching the current trickle past smooth stones and hearing the frogs croak in the reeds, I made a silent vow that if they wanted to steal water from me, I would cut off their entire supply at its very source. And so began the plan that would change everything. The plan not just to stop the HOA's pipeline, but to buy the land upstream where the creek originated from a natural spring in the hills, a spring owned by an old rancher who had been talking about retirement for years. And though it would take nearly every dime I had saved and a loan from the bank, I realized that securing the water source itself would give me leverage no HOA lawyer or bulldozer could undo. Because without water, their manicured lawns, fountains, and golf courses would wither into dust, and the power they wielded over their residents would dry up just as fast. And as I returned to the ranch house that night under the dim glow of the porch light, I knew the battle with the HOA had only just begun, but I felt the fire of determination burning inside me because they had trespassed, stolen, and mocked my rights, and now, I was ready to fight back in a way they would never see coming. The very next morning, after I made my decision by the creek, I saddled up and rode into town, my mind racing with the details of how I could actually pull this plan off. Because though the idea of buying the spring upstream was solid, dreams and deeds weren't the same as dollars and cents, and I knew it would take more than determination to wrestle the water supply out from under the HOA's greedy grip. I stopped first at the county records office, where I spent hours combing through dusty files and thick ledgers, tracing the ownership of the land where the spring bubbled up from the earth, and sure enough, just as I remembered, it belonged to an old rancher named Tom Hensley, a grizzled man in his 70s who had lived most of his life tending cattle and repairing barbed wire fences, but who had lost his wife a few years back and had started talking about hanging up the spurs and moving closer to his kids in another state. And as I sat there holding the file, I realized this might be the one stroke of luck in an otherwise uphill battle because Tom had no heirs left in town to keep the ranch running, and he'd already been approached by developers sniffing around with offers, though so far he had turned them down, saying he didn't trust city folks to take care of his land, so I decided then and there to pay him a visit. When I arrived at his weathered farmhouse later that day, he was sitting on the porch with a cup of black coffee, his dog stretched out at his feet, and I could see the years of hard work etched into his face, but when I shook his hand and sat down across from him, I spoke plainly, telling him about the HOA's illegal pipeline and how they were stealing water not just from me, but potentially from his spring as well, and I explained my plan to buy his land, keep the spring protected, and stop the HOA from draining both of our livelihoods dry. And though he listened quietly, his eyes narrowing as I laid out the details, I could tell he was weighing more than just dollars. He was thinking about legacy, about whether the land he loved would be preserved or paved over once he walked away. And finally he said, "Son, if it means keeping those leeches from sucking this place dry, I'd rather sell to you than anyone else." But of course, money was still a question, and when he named his price, I felt a pit in my stomach because while fair, it was steep, more than I could cover with what I had saved from cattle sales and leasing grazing. Right, so I knew the bank would have to be involved, and banks weren't exactly fond of ranchers with dreams of waging war against powerful HOAs, but still, I shook Tom's hand and told him I'd come back with an offer, and as I drove into town, I rehearsed my pitch to the loan officer, reminding myself that water rights were worth more than gold out here, and if I could just get control of the spring, the rest of the fight would be on my terms. The next few weeks became a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and tense meetings at the bank, where the loan officer, a cautious man named Richards, raised his eyebrows at my proposal, but eventually admitted that controlling a natural spring with documented water rights was as close to a guaranteed investment as a rancher could hope for. And after demanding collateral in the form of a lien on part of my existing ranch, he finally approved the loan, his pen scratching across the papers with an air of reluctance, but finality nonetheless, and I can still remember the surge of relief mixed with dread as I walked out of that office, knowing I had just signed away years of security for the chance to take on the HOA, but I also knew I couldn't live with myself if I rolled over and let them strip away what generations before me had worked to protect. When I returned to Tom with the paperwork in hand, he smiled faintly and said he figured I had the grit to pull it off, and within a week, the deed to his land, and more importantly, the rights to the spring were in my name, and that night I drove back up into the hills and stood by the water as it bubbled up cold and clear from the rocks, feeling for the first time like I had the upper hand, because no matter how many miles of pipe they buried in my pastures, without the flow from this spring, their entire network was nothing but empty steel, and I swore then and there that I would cut them off, not out of spite, but to remind them that they could not bully their way into resources that didn't belong to them. Meanwhile, the HOA had continued laying their pipeline deeper into my ranch, ignoring my protests and legal complaints, acting as if I were powerless to stop them, but their smug arrogance only fueled my resolve, and I began planning the day when I would shut the valves and leave them bone dry. But before that day could come, I had to ensure that everything was airtight because I knew the moment I acted, their army of lawyers would come crashing down on me, and so I hired a local attorney, a sharp young woman named Claire, who had a reputation for standing up to big corporations and never backing down. And when I explained the situation, she grinned and said, "They picked the wrong rancher to mess with." And together we began drafting documents that spelled out my rights in no uncertain terms, filing injunctions, gathering evidence of trespassing, and building a case strong enough to drag the HOA through every court in the state if necessary. But legal battles take time, and the HOA's pipeline was nearly complete, their president boasting in public meetings that soon their subdivision would have a sustainable water source, without ever admitting they had stolen it from under my nose. And though it made my blood boil, I kept my cool, because while they were busy patting themselves on the back, I held the one card they could never beat: ownership of the source itself. And when the day came to play it, I intended to make sure the whole town knew exactly how the mighty HOA had been brought to its knees by the very rancher they had tried to push aside. The weeks that followed were some of the most exhausting and nerve-wracking of my life, because while the HOA's contractors pressed forward with their pipeline, cutting trenches deeper across my pastures, and even erecting pump stations near the creek, I was quietly preparing my counterstrike, and every night as I sat at my kitchen table with documents spread out under the lamplight, I felt the weight of both fear and excitement, knowing that I held a weapon far stronger than fences or fists, the deed to the spring itself, but also knowing that if I moved too soon or too recklessly, their lawyers could twist the situation and paint me as the villain. So I bided my time, working closely with Claire, my attorney, who spent long evenings in my ranch house sipping black coffee and explaining in careful detail how water rights law could be a fortress if used correctly, and how the concept of prior appropriation meant that my claim to the spring dated back generations through Tom's family and now legally transferred to me, making it nearly impossible for the HOA to argue otherwise. Still, we both knew they wouldn't go down without a fight, and as construction wrapped up on their end, the smug president of the HOA, the same slick man in the tailored suit, even had the audacity to send me a letter dripping with arrogance, thanking me for my unintentional contribution to the community's infrastructure and implying that once their system was operational, I might consider negotiating a cooperative agreement with them for access to the creek, a letter so insulting that I laughed bitterly before tossing it in the fire, because it only confirmed what I already knew. They thought they had beaten me, that I was just a bump in the road on their path to controlling everything around them. Meanwhile, residents of the subdivision were already bragging on social media about the new water system their board had delivered, posting pictures of fountains that would soon spray high into the air and green lawns that would shine even in the heat of summer, and it made my blood boil to see how blind they were to the theft happening right under their noses. But I also realized their ignorance would make the eventual reveal all the more satisfying. I spent my days writing fence lines, inspecting where the pipeline cut through my ranch, noting every violation, every unpermitted crossing, every scar left in the soil, because each one would become a nail in the coffin of the HOA's arrogance once Claire filed the full case. And at night, I drove up into the hills to the spring, installing new locks and reinforced fencing, setting up cameras, and making sure no one could tamper with the water source, because I had no doubt that once they realized I controlled it, they might try something desperate. Sure enough, one evening I caught sight of unfamiliar tire tracks near the spring road, and my suspicions were confirmed when I later found a pair of men in reflective vests skulking around the area, clipboards in hand, claiming they were just surveyors, but the nervous way they avoided eye contact told me all I needed to know, and I ran them off with a warning shot in the air, making it clear that this land wasn't theirs to meddle with. And that was the night I truly understood the stakes of the battle ahead, because the HOA wasn't just going to roll over. They would push, scheme, and trespass until they got what they wanted, unless I stood firm as summer rolled on. The pipeline was declared complete at their end, and with a grand ceremony attended by their board members and clapping residents, they turned on the pumps for the first time, water roaring through the pipes like a beast, spilling into their decorative ponds and sprouting fountains high into the air, and they cheered as if they had achieved something noble, not realizing that their victory was temporary, built on a foundation that I now controlled. I stood at the edge of my pasture that day, watching the fountain spray from a distance, feeling a surge of both fury and grim amusement, because I knew the moment they had grown reliant on that stolen water, I would close my hand around the valve upstream and leave them gasping, and in that moment their arrogance would collapse. Yet patience was the hardest part, and Claire kept urging me not to act until we had everything lined up legally, reminding me that cutting off their supply too soon could be spun as sabotage instead of justice, so I forced myself to wait, even as I dreamed of the day their perfect lawns turned brown and their fountain sat empty, and in the meantime, I began talking to other ranchers in the county, explaining what the HOA had done and warning them that if these people weren't stopped, no one's land or water was safe, and I found allies in unexpected places, old-timers who hated the way subdivisions kept sprawling into farmland, younger ranchers tired of seeing corporate boards push around small landowners, and even townsfolk who disliked the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, and slowly a network of quiet support grew around me, people eager to see them taken down a notch. But still, the HOA continued acting as if they were untouchable, hosting garden parties by their new fountains, boasting about rising property values, and sending out smug newsletters about their independence from municipal water supplies, never realizing that I was standing over their source. Like a hawk, and as the long days of summer burned on, I began to feel the tension coil tighter and tighter inside me, knowing the storm was coming, knowing that when the time was right, I would strike not just with vengeance, but with the undeniable force of the law and the cold reality of a shut-off valve, and when that day arrived, the HOA's empire of arrogance would crumble as quickly as it had been built. By the time the first signs of autumn began creeping across the hills, with the leaves of the cottonwoods along the creek turning gold and the evenings carrying a chill that reminded me of harvest season, the HOA's shiny new fountains had become the centerpiece of their community, and residents strutted around proudly, showing off their perpetually green lawns to visitors, all while bragging that they had solved the water problem forever. But what none of them knew was that their entire paradise depended on one source, my spring, and that with a single turn of a valve I could reduce their celebration to chaos, yet still Claire advised patience, telling me that the smartest move wasn't to strike in secret, but to do it in a way that exposed their theft in the most public and undeniable manner possible. So together we built a strategy that would deliver both the cutoff and the proof in one devastating blow. First, she filed a detailed complaint with the county court outlining every trespass, every illegal trench, and every violation of water law they had committed, complete with photos I had taken of their bulldozers ripping up my land. And then she scheduled a hearing to present the case, but she warned me that just filing paperwork wasn't enough because HOA lawyers were experts at twisting stories and hiding behind technicalities, so the real key would be demonstrating control, showing that I wasn't just claiming rights to the spring, but actively exercising them, and that meant preparing for the showdown in a way that would leave no doubt about who held the power. I remember the night we sat at my kitchen table going over the plan, the wind rattling the windows while Claire leaned over the papers with that determined fire in her eyes, and she said, "We'll wait until the HOA is fully dependent on your water, until they've convinced everyone their system is a permanent success, and then, when the timing is right, you shut them down in front of the world, and we'll present the deed, the water rights, and the court filings all at once." And though the thought of waiting longer gnawed at me, I knew she was right because a quiet victory could be spun as vandalism, but a public collapse would reveal the truth in a way even their slick president couldn't deny. So I waited, watching as September passed into October, their fountains gurgling happily, sprinklers whirring across perfect lawns, and HOA board members boasting in local papers about their innovative leadership until finally the hearing date was set for late October, and I knew the stage was ready. In the days leading up to it, I prepared the spring itself, installing a reinforced gate with a massive padlock over the valve and running extra fencing around the perimeter because I had no doubt that once the HOA realized what was happening, they might try desperate measures to keep their lifeline flowing, and I wasn't about to let them sneak in and tamper with my property under cover of darkness. And then on the morning of the hearing, with the courthouse packed with residents from both sides of the county, ranchers on my side and HOA members on theirs, I stood in front of the judge while Claire laid out the case with calm precision, presenting deed after deed, showing photographs of my family's long-standing claim to the creek and Tom's transfer of the spring to me, until even the judge raised his eyebrows at the clarity of the evidence. But the HOA's lawyers tried every trick they could, arguing about community necessity, citing vague statutes, and even claiming that because the pipeline was already built, dismantling it would cause irreparable harm to hundreds of families. But Claire cut them down with one sharp line after another, reminding the court that necessity did not equal ownership and that no one, no matter how powerful, had the right to steal resources from private property without consent. Still, the judge held back from issuing a ruling right away, clearly wary of the political fallout, and scheduled a continuation for the following week. But by then, the trap we had set was already ready to spring, because while the lawyers postured and argued, the subdivision was blissfully unaware that their water supply wasn't theirs to begin with. And on the Saturday after the hearing, when the HOA hosted a massive community festival around their central park to show off the fountains, complete with food trucks, music, and speeches by board members, I drove quietly up into the hills at dawn, unlocked the gate, and turned the valve to shut off the spring, watching as the once strong flow trickled down to nothing, the pipes leading downhill groaning as air filled them instead of water. And though I felt a pang of nerves, I also felt a wave of grim satisfaction because I knew that by the time their festival hit full swing, the fountains would sputter, the sprinklers would die, and panic would set in. Sure enough, by mid-afternoon, reports began trickling through social media of residents confused and angry, staring at fountains that had collapsed into muddy puddles, lawns already browning under the autumn sun, and the HOA president scrambling to reassure everyone that it was just a technical glitch. But within hours, the truth began to seep out as rumors spread that I had shut them down at the source. And when I walked into town that evening to grab supplies, I could feel the tension in the air half. The people glaring at me with hostility, the other half nodding with quiet approval, because word had already spread. The rancher had cut off the HOA. It was the showdown everyone had been waiting for. And though I knew the coming week would be filled with court battles and angry confrontations, I also knew the tide had turned, because their aura of invincibility had shattered the moment the water stopped flowing, and for the first time, they were forced to face the reality that without the land and the spring I now owned, their entire empire of lawns and fountains was nothing but a mirage built on stolen ground. The fallout from shutting off the water supply hit harder and faster than even I had imagined, because by the very next morning the subdivision was in full-blown crisis mode, with angry residents storming the HOA office demanding answers, sprinklers lying useless across their manicured lawns, and the once proud fountains in the Central Park now reduced to crack basins filled with stagnant puddles. And though the HOA president stood on the steps of his mansion trying to calm the crowd with promises of temporary repairs, it was clear that panic had already begun spreading through their pristine streets, as people realized that the lush, artificial paradise they had been promised was entirely dependent on something they didn't actually own. Meanwhile, I stood at the edge of my ranch with a pair of binoculars, watching from a distance as trucks from the HOA maintenance team rushed back and forth in a futile attempt to restart the pumps. And though a part of me felt a twinge of pity for the ordinary residents, many of whom had no idea their board had stolen water from my land, the larger part of me felt vindicated, because this wasn't just about lawns and fountains. It was about principle, about proving that my family's land and resources couldn't be trampled by entitled bureaucrats who thought they were above the law. Later that afternoon, as I was checking fences, a convoy of black SUVs roared up my dirt driveway in a cloud of dust, and outstepped the HOA. President himself, flanked by two lawyers in crisp suits and a handful of board members who looked more rattled than they cared to admit, and though their presence stirred a fire in my gut, I met them calmly on the porch, arms crossed, waiting for the storm, and sure enough, the president launched into a tirade, accusing me of sabotage, of endangering families, and of using the water supply as a weapon. But I didn't flinch. I simply handed him a copy of the deed to the spring, stamped and signed by the county clerk, and said in a steady voice, "You don't own a drop of it, and you never did." And the way his smug expression faltered for just a split second told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't believed I had actually pulled off the purchase. They thought I was bluffing all along. But of course his lawyers immediately jumped in, waving folders of paperwork and threatening injunctions, lawsuits, and damages, trying to overwhelm me with their barrage of legal jargon. Yet, before I could even respond, Claire pulled up in her old pickup, stepped out with her briefcase, and cut through their noise with the sharp efficiency of a blade, telling them in no uncertain terms that every trespass, every unauthorized trench, and every gallon of stolen water was now documented and filed with the county court, and that if they wanted to fight, we were prepared to drag their entire board through the mud of a very public trial. And the sudden shift in their demeanor was almost comical. Board members who had arrived puffed up with arrogance now avoided my eyes, muttering nervously as they realized the situation wasn't just a dispute, it was a disaster with their fingerprints all over it. Still, the president wasn't ready to surrender, and he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a hiss as he said, "You're playing a dangerous game, rancher. Without that water, hundreds of families are going to suffer, and the blame will fall squarely on your shoulders," to which I replied coldly, "The only people to blame are the ones who thought stealing from me was the same as winning," and with that I turned and walked back into the house, leaving them sputtering on the porch. That night the tension boiled over in town, with heated debates erupting at the diner, the feed store, and even the courthouse steps, some siding with the HOA, calling me selfish for cutting off the water, others backing me fully, saying it was high time someone stood up to them. And though I tried to ignore the gossip, it was impossible not to hear the way my name had suddenly become the center of every conversation, half villain, half folk hero, depending on who was speaking. Over the next few days, the HOA tried everything they could to regain control, sending work crews to the Spring Road, only to find the reinforced gates and my locks in their way, filing emergency motions in court to force me to reopen the flow, and even staging press conferences to paint me as an extremist. But with every attempt, they only dug their hole deeper, because the more they spoke, the clearer it became that their entire operation had been built on stolen land and stolen water, and local reporters began showing up at my ranch, asking for my side of the story. And when I finally gave an interview standing by the creek explaining the history of my family's water rights and how the HOA had bulldozed through without permission, the public tide began to shift because people who had once only seen the glossy surface of the HOA's world were now being forced to confront the rot beneath it. Still, I knew this was only the beginning, because their lawyers weren't going to stop with press releases. They were going to throw everything they had at me in court, and I had to be ready. But for the first time since the whole mess began, I felt like the ground had tilted in my favor, because I wasn't just the lone rancher shouting at bulldozers anymore. I was the man who had cut off their empire at the source, and no matter how many threats they hurled, the simple fact remained. Without me, they had no water, no fountains, no green lawns, and no power, and that truth was stronger than any argument their attorneys could conjure. The days after the confrontation on my porch turned into a tense waiting game, because while the HOA scrambled to regain control of their crumbling paradise, I knew their lawyers were working overtime to prepare their next strike, and sure enough, within a week I was served with a thick packet of legal documents accusing me of everything from intentional sabotage to public endangerment, claiming that by shutting off the water, I had jeopardized the health and safety of their entire subdivision. And though the accusations were ridiculous given that the water had never been theirs to begin with, I still felt a cold weight settle in my stomach as I flipped through page after page of their legal jargon, because I understood exactly what they were doing. They weren't trying to win outright. They were trying to drown me in paperwork, bleed me dry with endless court battles until I either surrendered or went broke, and for a brief moment, doubt gnawed at me, whispering that maybe I had bitten off more than I could chew. But then I remembered the smug smile of their president when he told me I should be grateful they were improving property values, and the doubt burned away into anger. Claire, as always, was a steady force, reminding me that the truth was on our side, that the documents I held were ironclad proof of my ownership, and that no judge worth his robe would let them spin theft into legality. So we prepared for the next hearing with meticulous care, gathering every witness we could, ranchers who had seen the bulldozers trespassing, surveyors who confirmed the boundaries of my land, even Tom Hensley himself, who agreed to testify that he had sold me the spring specifically to keep it safe from the HOA's greedy grasp. And by the time we walked into the courthouse again, I felt the fire in my chest, not fear this time, but determination. The hearing was long and brutal, with the HOA's lawyers painting me as a selfish holdout, standing in the way of progress, throwing around phrases like community welfare and necessity doctrine. But when Claire stood and presented our side, she did it with such clarity and force that the judge himself leaned forward to listen. And when she dropped the deed to the spring on the table with a sharp thud, the courtroom went silent, because no amount of spin could erase the reality of legal ownership. And though the judge once again held back from issuing a final ruling, citing the complexity of the case, it was clear from the murmurs in the gallery that the tide of public opinion had shifted even further. Still, the HOA refused to back down, and their president, red-faced with fury, stormed out of the courthouse vowing that this wasn't over, that they would take the fight all the way to the state Supreme Court if necessary. But what he didn't realize was that every day the fountain sat dry, every morning the lawns turned browner, and every night residents grew angrier. The foundation of his power was crumbling beneath him, and already whispers were spreading through the subdivision of board members facing recall elections, of homeowners questioning why their dues had been spent on an illegal pipeline instead of legitimate infrastructure, and I could see cracks forming in their once unified front. Meanwhile, life on my ranch continued with a steady rhythm. It always had cattle to feed, fences to mend, fields to check, and though the legal storm raged around me, there was something grounding about the work, something that reminded me why I was fighting in the first place, because this land and its water weren't just commodities to be traded and exploited. They were the legacy of my grandfather, the lifeblood of generations, and the future I hoped to preserve for whoever came after me, and no slick-suited president of an HOA was going to take that away. Of course, the HOA's desperation began spilling into darker territory, and one night I was jolted awake by the barking of my dogs, only to find the padlock on the spring gate smashed and muddy footprints leading toward the valve. But thankfully I had installed not only cameras, but also a heavy steel cage around the mechanism, and though the vandals had clearly tried to force it open, they hadn't succeeded, and when I reviewed the footage, I recognized two of the same maintenance men I had run off months earlier, which only confirmed that the HOA was willing to cross any line to get their water back. But instead of rushing to the sheriff, I gave the footage straight to Claire, and she filed it as evidence of criminal trespass, strengthening our case further. The next morning, the HOA president called me directly for the first time since the showdown, his voice sharp with desperation, as he demanded that I reopen the flow for the good of the community, but I cut him off mid-sentence and told him the only deal he would get was in a courtroom. And when he tried to threaten me with financial ruin, I simply hung up, because I could hear the weakness creeping into his tone, the cracks in his confidence, and I knew he was starting to feel the walls closing in. The strangest part of it all was the shift in public reaction. While some residents of the subdivision still glared at me when I walked through town, more and more were starting to approach me quietly, admitting they hadn't known the board had acted illegally, asking what could be done to fix things, even apologizing for the way they had dismissed me before. And though I wasn't naive enough to think they were all on my side, I could feel the pressure building against the HOA from within their own ranks like a dam ready to burst, and I realized that sooner or later the president and his cronies would face not just me but their own residents demanding accountability. Still, I stayed vigilant because the fight wasn't over, and as I stood by the spring one evening watching the sun sink behind the hills, the air cool and crisp, with the promise of winter, I promised myself again that no matter how long it took, I wouldn't back down, because this wasn't just about one rancher versus an HOA. It was about proving that greed and arrogance couldn't override truth and law, and that sometimes the smallest stream of water, protected with stubborn determination, could bring even the mightiest empire to its knees. As November rolled in and the first frosts dusted the fields, the pressure on the HOA reached a boiling point, because the longer their fountains sat bone dry and the lawns shriveled into brittle brown patches, the angrier their residents became. And I started hearing reports from friends in town that community meetings inside the subdivision were devolving into shouting matches, with homeowners demanding answers about why their exorbitant dues had been wasted on an illegal project that left them without water, while the board, red faced and scrambling, insisted that it was only a temporary setback and that victory in court would soon force me to reopen the flow. But those excuses were wearing thinner by the day, and several board members had already resigned under the pressure, leaving the president increasingly isolated, clinging to his arrogance like a man clings to a sinking ship. Meanwhile, Claire and I pressed forward with our case, filing not only for injunctions against further trespassing, but also seeking damages for the destruction of my land. And though I had no illusions about the glacial pace of the courts, every filing added more weight to the mountain of evidence stacked against them. And I began to notice a shift in the tone of the local media as well, because at first the newspapers had painted me as a stubborn holdout threatening the greater good, but now, with footage of the pipeline trench scarring my ranch and testimonies from other ranchers about the dangers of unchecked HOA power, the narrative was changing, and I was being cast less as an obstructionist and more as a man standing up for property rights, which only fueled my resolve. Of course, the HOA wasn't finished playing dirty, and one night I was driving back from town when I noticed headlights trailing me along the empty county road, staying just far enough back to be suspicious, and when I pulled into my ranch, they slowed at the end of the drive before speeding off into the dark, leaving me with the uneasy realization that intimidation was now part of their playbook. But instead of fear, it only hardened my resolve, and I doubled my security around the spring, hiring a couple of trusted hands to keep watch and investing in better cameras, because if they wanted to come after me, I was going to make sure they were caught red-handed. What they didn't realize was that their desperation was already unraveling their power from within, because at the very next HOA meeting, a group of angry residents stood up and demanded a recall vote, furious that their dues had been spent on lawsuits instead of actual services. And when the president tried to shout them down with threats of fines and penalties, someone recorded the entire exchange and leaked it online, where it went viral in the local community, making him look less like a leader and more like a tyrant lashing out at his own people. And I couldn't help but smile when I saw it, because it proved what I had suspected all along. The HOA's greatest enemy wasn't me, it was their own arrogance, and I had simply given them the push that exposed it. Still, I knew better than to celebrate too soon, because desperate men make desperate moves, and I braced myself for the possibility that they might try one last underhanded scheme to regain control of the spring. And sure enough, a week later, I woke to find the gate at the spring road had been rammed by a truck in the middle of the night, the steel bent, but not broken, the ground littered with shattered glass and tire tracks that led back toward the subdivision. And though the damage was minimal, it was the clearest sign yet that the HOA president had lost all sense of restraint, willing to risk criminal charges just to claw back what he thought was his. And when the sheriff's deputies came out to investigate, they shook their heads grimly, telling me that while they couldn't prove who had done it without catching them in the act, the evidence was mounting, and that sooner or later the board would collapse under the weight of both legal and criminal exposure. In the meantime, Claire advised me to stay steady, to keep pressing the case forward and not give in to their intimidation tactics, and I followed her advice even when the HOA tried to offer me a backroom deal, an obscene sum of money in exchange for permanent rights to the water. But I refused without hesitation, because this fight had never been about money, it was about principle, and I wasn't about to sell out just because they finally realized how much power the spring gave me. By late November, the subdivision was in full rebellion, with lawns dead, property values plummeting, and residents openly threatening to sue their own board for mismanagement. And when I heard that a petition for the president's removal had gathered hundreds of signatures, I knew the endgame was approaching, because without him, the entire machine of greed and arrogance that had targeted my ranch would fall apart, and I could finally start to think about healing the scars they had left on my land. But even then, I didn't let my guard down, because I had learned the hard way that victory isn't secure until the last card is played. And as I stood once more at the spring, watching the cold water bubble up untouched by the chaos downstream, I reminded myself that patience had brought me this far, and that with just a little more resolve, the HOA that had once laughed in. My face would soon be nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in town about what happens when arrogance tries to steal from the land and the people who refuse to let it go. Winter came in with sharp winds and nights, so cold the cattle's breath rose like smoke across the pasture. But inside the subdivision, the atmosphere was even frostier, because by December, the once proud HOA was in total collapse, their president clinging to office by his fingernails while residents held emergency meetings in living rooms and garages, plotting his removal. And when the recall vote finally came, it was less a contest and more a landslide, with angry homeowners ousting him and the remaining board members in one fell swoop, leaving behind nothing but a fractured shell of what had once been an iron-fisted organization. And though I wasn't there to see it firsthand, word spread fast in town, carried by neighbors who couldn't hide their satisfaction at seeing arrogance fall so hard. The lawsuits they had filed against me were withdrawn shortly after, their legal fund drained, their attorneys abandoning ship. Once it became clear there was no money left to pay them, and with the board dissolved, the subdivision was forced to reorganize under new leadership, people who were more interested in keeping the roads plowed and the trash collected than trying to seize water that didn't belong to them. And when the new president, a tired-looking woman with no taste for conflict, came to visit me on my porch, she offered a handshake and an apology on behalf of the residents, admitting that they had been led astray by promises of endless fountains and green lawns in a place where the land had never been meant to sustain such extravagance. And though I didn't trust her right away, I could see in her eyes that she understood the truth the old board never had, that the land dictates its own limits, and those who ignore them pay dearly. Over the next few weeks, I turned my focus back to the ranch, repairing fences, reseeding the scars left by the pipeline trench, and strengthening the spring's protections with sturdier fencing, because while the fight was over, I wasn't about to let history repeat itself. And as I worked, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, the constant hum of tension fading until it was replaced by the steady rhythm of ranch life, a rhythm I had nearly lost to the greed of men who thought paper rules gave them the right to steal from the land itself. People in town began treating me differently too, not with the suspicion or coldness they once had, but with respect, sometimes even admiration, because the story of the rancher who bought the water source to cut off an arrogant HOA had spread like wildfire, and whether folks agreed with my methods or not, they couldn't deny the outcome, that I had stood my ground against a machine that usually crushed people without a second thought, and I had walked away victorious. One evening, as I sat by the spring with the sun setting in fire over the hills, Claire joined me with 2 cups of coffee, and for long while we just listened to the water trickle, the same sound my grandfather must have listened to countless times, and I realized that in defending this place, I had not only honored his legacy, but also forged one of my own, a story that would be told long after the HOA and its arrogance had been forgotten, and in that moment, the bruises of the fight seemed worth it. Still, there were moments of reflection where I wondered if I had been too harsh, if cutting off the water entirely had punished innocent residents along with the guilty board. But then I remembered the smashed fences, the bulldozers tearing through my land without a second thought, the threats and intimidation, and I knew that mercy for the arrogant would only have encouraged them further, and that sometimes the only way to teach respect for boundaries is through hard consequences, consequences that can't be ignored or spun away by lawyers and empty speeches. In the spring that followed, the subdivision slowly adapted to its new reality. The grand fountains that had once shot water high into the sky were dismantled, replaced by modest landscaping that matched the climate, and though some residents moved away, others found a strange sort of pride in surviving without the excess, a recognition that living in the shadow of the ranch and its spring meant respecting the natural balance instead of trying to conquer it. And on more than one occasion, I caught sight of children from the subdivision riding their bikes past my fence, waving shyly before disappearing down the road, and I wondered if maybe, just maybe, something good had come from all the chaos, a reminder to the next generation that arrogance has no place on land that has existed long before them and will endure long after. As for me, I carried on as I always had, but with a sharper sense of vigilance and a deeper appreciation for the water that bubbled steadily from the earth. Because I had learned that in a world where men will lay pipelines across another's land without a second thought, protecting what is yours isn't just about survival, it's about preserving truth. And though the HOA had once seemed unstoppable, they had fallen like dominoes when confronted with a man too stubborn to be broken. And so, as the seasons turned and the ranch thrived again, I found peace in knowing that I had not only defended my land, but also written a story that proved something greater, that no matter how powerful or organized arrogance may seem, it only takes one man standing firm, one spring, guarded with relentless determination, to bring the whole rotten structure crashing down, leaving behind not just silence, but the sound of water, pure and unyielding, flowing as it always had, a reminder that some things can never be stolen, only defended by those willing to fight for them.